Ooty Lit Fest, but all those who are coming, that I have not been able to come and I wanted to. Actually, the fact is that my loss is greater than yours, because I was sure that I'm going to meet a lot of good people there, and I would learn a lot meeting all of them. But somehow I have this problem, lower back problem, and that occurs, I mean, once in a while. Since last 4-5 years I did not have this problem, but it happened that I get a acute spasm in my lower back, and then for quite a few days I just cannot get up from the bed or lie down. I have to take somebody's support, and this is the 5th day, and I suppose in next 4-5 days I'll be all right, because that is what it happens every time. And I have this problem since last almost 5 years, but unfortunately it had to happen now. On the 29th of last month I got this problem, and I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry and apologize, and I hope that the organizers will invite me next year, and next year I'll be able to come and meet all of you. But please forgive me, and believe me, my loss is bigger than yours.
Right, so do we start? Yes. Right. Okay, so we just heard that a sad apology from Javed Bhai that he can't be here. The fact is that we are compensating for that in some way by actually having him on screen performing some of the poems that we're going to discuss today. Sumantra Ghosal, when I last looked, was making ad films. He is supposed to be one of the leading ad filmmakers in the country. He also makes beautiful documentary films on artists. And suddenly, here he is in this incarnation of translator. Translator from Urdu, which is a demanding language to translate from, particularly if you're attempting to get it into English. So we're going to have a very interesting conversation about how did this happen. How did Sumantra get attracted to the poetry of Javed Akhtar, and what, as a translator, has been his journey through the arc of Javed Akhtar's poetry writing. Now, Javed, the sort of fascinating thing about Javed Akhtar is that he's a name that is widely known. Everybody sort of recognizes his name, largely because of the connection with Bollywood. But he is one of the poets in a language which many people are very ready to write off as a language of the past, a sort of genteel has-been that has had its moment and is no longer really relevant or valid. And here is a poet who is making it very contemporary. The way he writes is something that can be accessible to almost anybody who has some Hindustani or some ability to follow Hindi. And that is a remarkable achievement. So that is why he travels widely, and his audiences are always spilling out of the halls, because when they hear him, it's a language and thoughts and ideas that are very easily accessible. So starting from that point of being accessible, Sumantra, can you tell us about how you came into this new phase or concurrent phase of translating?
Well, in a sense new, in a sense concurrent, in the sense that I continue to make films when foolish people still commission me. But otherwise, it is something that continues. I make right now a series of films for a museum in Bangalore called MAP, which all of you should visit if you ever find yourself in Bangalore. But to come back to Urdu, and I actually find myself a little rudderless in the sea of Urdu today without Javed Sahab beside me, making things easy. The way I came into this, into the idea of translation was completely by accident. I am a Bengali who has no connection with Urdu whatsoever. We didn't grow up with Urdu. We grew up with Thakur Sahib back in Calcutta, Rabindranath. And basically, the way this happened is that his wife, Shabana Azmi, again, I think quite foolishly, came up to me and asked me to make a film on her father, Kaifi Azmi. Since she knew that I had no idea about Urdu, that's the first person she asked. And not knowing Urdu, I immediately said, yes, of course I'll do it. And I did. And as a result, what happened is that having said yes quite exuberantly, I was then stuck because I didn't really know the language, I didn't really know the poetry. So what I did is I started translating Kaifi Saab because I thought that if I did that, if I began to deal with the poetry to start with, then I would be dealing with text, I'd be dealing with context, and I would be dealing with subtext. And that would help me make my film. So that started me off on this road to translations from Urdu. And somehow Javed Saab and Shabana seemed to think that what I did was okay. And so the next stage was that Javed Saab came to me and said, I'm bringing out a book of my father's poems, Javed Akhtar, who I'd never read, stupidly, and why don't you translate it? So I said, yes, of course. And so that journey started, and my interest in Urdu goes back a long time, but that doesn't mean I'm allowed to translate from it, but having been given this ticket of freedom by the powers that be, I said, what the hell, let's go for it. Javed Saab, I have always been interested in, particularly because of his accessibility, which is not so true of Kaifi Saab and Javed Akhtar for somebody like me, who is really ignorant of the language. Javed's language being Hindustani and Urdu, but more Hindustani, which he proudly declaims as Hindustani, was easier for me to understand, was closer to my own life and whatever I was going through. And so I began translations on my own. Javed Saab didn't know that I was doing this because one doesn't wish to share foolishness beyond a point. So one hadn't told him that. But at some point he got to know, and again he didn't demur. So I proceeded, and I enjoy translating his poems, and that's how it all came to be, by happen chance, accident, and a large, large dose of foolishness.
Perfect combination or recipe for turning out good translations, I would say. So you had said when we were talking about this earlier that it's been fun and it's been a hobby for you, something that you've loved doing and that's sort of challenged you. And as you were saying, very often you love doing it when you're on long car rides, something to play with. And yet at the same time, there is a sense in your working with his poems that you have developed a sense of his journey as a poet.
Yeah, that
in
is
terms
true.
of So maybe you can share some of his poems with us.
Okay, let's start with the poetry, because since this is a lit fest, why not have some poetry? Basically, what I'll do is I'll have the temerity to read out a poem in Urdu, which ordinarily Javed Saab would have done, and then I will shut up on that front and let Javed Saab do the rest of the recitation. So this first poem I'm reading out because it's short, but it's also because it goes back to an idea of Javed Saab as a poet that I think is very interesting to me, which is nostalgia and romanticism, which is not what I associate his poetry with today. Neither romanticism nor nostalgia, because he's very much a poet who lives and works and thrives, I would say, in the present. So this poem is short, and in a way, it's a simple poem, so it would be a good introduction to the language as well. It's called Mera Aangan, Mera Ped. मेरा आंगन कितना कुशादा, कितना बड़ा था, जिसमें मेरे सारे खेल समा जाते थे, और आंगन के आगे था वो पेड़ कि जो मुझसे काफी ऊंचा था, लेकिन मुझको इसका यकीन था जब मैं बड़ा हो जाऊंगा इस पेड़ की फूंगी भी छू लूंगा। बरसों बाद मैं घर लौटा हूं, देख रहा हूं ये आंगन कितना छोटा है, पेड़ मगर पहले से भी थोड़ा ऊंचा है. So for me, there is this romanticism, this idea of nostalgia, but also embedded in it is the idea of growing up and leaving your past behind, which comes back in other poems of his. And now you're in for it. Here's the translation. It's called My Courtyard, My Tree. That's the easy bit. My courtyard, both broad and wide, could afford in every way to contain my play. Beyond the yard was that tree, so much taller than me. But this I knew as a certain fact, that when I grew up and came back, I would reach out and I would be able to touch the tip of that tree. Years later, when I've come home again, I can see how unfree and how small this courtyard is. But the tree, I see, has grown a little more and is taller than before.
Now that deserves a clap. So one of the most notable things I would say about the translation for someone who works with translation is the way he's been able to capture the simplicity and the directness, and in some ways the homely domesticity of the way the original was written. It's a poem where it's almost like a person is talking to themselves and musing about something, and he's caught that in the English. And I don't know if anybody in this audience has ever tried translating from an Indian language into English. Hands up if you have. Okay, not bad. I think you'll agree with me that one of the toughest things is to translate from an Indian language, whether it's Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, Gujarati, Urdu, into English, because there's a sensibility difference. The softness and maybe the sort of richness of the original language and the way English expresses itself, there's a kind of sense of it not working. So it's very interesting that he's managed to circumvent that without sounding false or without sounding artificial, and at the same time managed to capture the essential meaning of that poem. So I think a round of applause again for this totally serendipitous translator.
I'm so happy you're my interlocutor. Couldn't have wished for better. Should we move to Javed Saab speaking now?
Yes, let's do that.
And just go to the master instead of these apprentices? Let's have the first video, Dushwari.
Which means dilemma.
मैं भूल जाऊं तुम्हें अब यही मुनासिब है, मैं भूल जाऊं तुम्हें अब यही मुनासिब है, मगर भुलाना भी चाहूं तो किस तरह भूलूं कि तुम तो फिर भी हकीकत हो, कोई ख्वाब नहीं. यहां तो दिल का ये आलम मैं क्या कहूं कमबख्त, भुला सका ना ये वो सिलसिला जो था ही नहीं, वो एक ख्याल जो आवाज तक गया ही नहीं, वो एक बात जो मैं कह नहीं सका तुमसे, वो एक रब्त संबंध, वो एक रब्त जो हम में कभी रहा ही नहीं, मुझे है याद वो सब जो कभी हुआ ही नहीं.
So we see a huge shift in this particular poem from the earlier poem in terms of, I think it's modernity as well. I mean, this is a modern voice speaking about a love that was not spoken about. And while it remains within the Urdu sort of form of the love poem, I think it's a wonderful take and a Javedian take on that idea. So this is what it sounds like in English. It is best that I forget you now, but how? You are no dream, you are real, and in my foolish heart I feel I cannot forget the connections that never happened. That thought unspent that never went to my lips, that word unuttered that I could not say to you. that connect that in effect wasn't there. My memories are astir with things that never were, that never happened.
Right. Again, if you notice that this is a poem about things that never happened, you know, and it's all in the realm of possibility. It's remained as something that you either look back on with regret or you look back on with wonder what could have happened if it had been spoken or if the bond had happened. But it's, as a conceit, it's very interesting.
And I think it's a mature look at something that was never spoken about.
Right.
It's not it's not bitter, it's not, it is, there is a let's get on with it as well, while not having the prosaicness of that sentence,
Right.
that idea.
And one aspect of his poetry, which I'm hoping the next poem will bring out more, which you had talked about, was his ability to start exploring things in a certain kind of logical way. Like even here, he starts off with saying that, I should forget you, but how? It's a little bit like Shakespeare's Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And then but, and then the buts begin, you know? And there's a sense of following a kind of logical step-by-step chain.
Yeah, but before we come to that, I think we'll come to the idea of the ghazal. Because I think that what's critical in Urdu poetry as well, before we come to the idea of, yes, he does use the idea of logic, but when you say Urdu poetry, almost immediately there's a sort of reaction, oh, the ghazal, as if it is something well-known, a friend, if you're a friend of poetry.
And you were saying that he'd kind of forbidden you to try a ghazal.
Yeah,
it's a lovely story. Tell us about that.
Well, basically, when I started working with Javed on translations of his father and other translations as well, he said to me, look, you're okay in translations, but don't do the ghazal. So I said, but what's the problem, Javed sir? So he said, no, it's a form that you shouldn't touch. It is a form and a kind of, the rhyme scheme and all of that it just doesn't work in English. And naturally, immediately, I started translating the ghazal. And did two ghazals, but because for an audience which may not know why, this sort of verbotenness about the ghazal, let's hear Javed Saab tell you what a ghazal is, so you'll know what the complications are. What is a ghazal? Javed Saab.
Ghazal is like a box of assorted biscuits. You know, within one box you have different kind of biscuits. Some of them salted, some of them are sweet, some are cream biscuits and so on and so forth, but within one box. In ghazal, every couplet means sher, जिसे हम बोलते हैं. Sher is made of two lines. And lines are called misra. एक misra, दूसरा misra. एक sher. Every sher is complete in itself. It may not have any connection with the sher earlier or the sher later. It is a complete statement in itself. So it means ghazal has 6 shares or 7 shares or 10 shares. Each one of them is complete. And it may be different shares, may be on totally different topics. Nothing to do with each other. Then why are they together? How they are together? They are together because, one, that they have the same meter the length of the line. Then they are put together and they are within this club because of the rhyme. Like, I'll give you an example. दिल नाज़ा तुझे हुआ क्या है? आखिर इस दर्द की दवा क्या है? तो the rhyme is हुआ, दवा. This is rhyme. But there is one more thing in it, which is repeated, which is recurring. That is, हुआ क्या है? दवा क्या है? ये क्या है is being repeated. While the rhyme is changing, दवा, हुआ, इधर क्या है same है. This क्या है is called radif. And the rhyme is called kafiya.
The first share of the ghazal has rhyme in both the lines. जैसे ये है, दिल नादा तुझे हुआ क्या है, आखिर इस दर्द की दवा क्या है, हमें मुश्ताक और वो बेजार. Now there is no rhyme here. या इलाही ये माजरा क्या है. Again the rhyme comes and the radif comes. So this is the discipline. Now within this discipline, in every share, you can say different things. They may or may not be connected with the earlier or the later. The first share of the ghazal, where the rhyme is in both the lines, is called matla. Matla, in literal sense from dictionary, it means horizon. So the first share that has rhyme in both the things is the horizon of ghazal, and after that, because of the meter, because of the rhyme and the same radif, which keeps on coming again and again, they are together.
Hope you're sufficiently confused by now. This is the problem with the ghazal, that what tends to happen in translation is you translate it in couplets, because that's an easy way out of doing it while sort of pretending, to be poetic. So I decided that I would stay with Kafia and Radif, but I'll come to that. We listened to the poem that I've translated. I've translated 2 ghazals before I venture further. But 2 ghazals, starting with one. Play the next video, which is Jo Baat Kehte Darte Hain Sab.
जो बात कहते डरते हैं सब, तू वो बात लिख, इतनी अंधेरी थी न कभी पहले रात, लिख. जो बात कहते डरते हैं सब, तू वो बात लिख, इतनी अंधेरी थी न कभी पहले रात, लिख. जिनसे कसीदे लिखे थे वो फेंक दे कलम, जिनसे कसीदे लिखे थे वो फेंक दे कलम, फिर खूने दिल से सच्चे कलम की सिफात लिख. जो रोजनामों न्यूज़पेपर्स, जो रोजनामों में कहीं पाती नहीं जगह, जो रोजनामों में कहीं पाती नहीं जगह, जो रोज हर जगह की है वो वारदात लिख. जो वाकयात हो चुके उनका तो जिक्र है, जो वाकयात हो चुके उनका तो जिक्र है, लेकिन जो होने चाहिए वो वाकयात लिख.
What they all fear to speak, of those thoughts unspoken, write. The night was never as deep, of that darkness unbroken, write. Throw away those instruments with which once you wrote paeans, dip your pen in the blood of your heart, and stricken, write. Of things that find no place in the papers, those daily events of which no news is broken, write. Break down your confines, break out of circumscription, come out under the open skies of a new world awoken, write. Things past will of course be spoken of what should be, of signs that betoken, write. If you wish to see the garden flower again, let each branch sing out of each leaf's life unspoken, write.
So you see how cleverly and masterfully he has managed to retain the rhyming as well as that repeated refrain which is there in the poem. So here in this poem, I think you all feel it, we see a very different Javed Saab. You know, somebody who is speaking very directly, that maybe the overwhelming emotion here, rather than nostalgia, melancholy, is more an urgency and maybe even an anger, you know. So would you like to talk a little bit about how this ghazal, the one that you want us to
See, this
hear?
is very different to what one expects of a ghazal, which is considered a love poem, was considered, but it has obviously over time progressed, as other things have as well. And now the ghazal form remains. You can't change qafiya, radif and things like that and say, I'm writing a ghazal. That's not considered to be right or true or honest. So you have to maintain the form, but the topic, the subject matter of ghazals has now expanded dramatically into all kinds of politics, issues, reality, problems, all sorts of stuff. It's not restricted to love anymore. Here I feel there is a thematic unity. Ghazals tend to continue to have a thematic unity. It's that box of chocolates. So it continues to be a box of chocolates. You don't go in there and get samosas as well. You continue to get chocolates and assorted chocolates within that box, but you're buying the box of chocolates, not of other things. Here I find that there is a thematic continuity. There is a continuity of theme, and the lines are not, as Javed Sahab has said, which can be in ghazal, completely different from each other. There is a continuity. In the next ghazal, there will be continuity, but there will be more disparity between lines, in the sense that lines could veer off more than they do in this particular ghazal. So we'll hear the next one, which is again not a love poem at all. It is in fact quite a political poem. As his later poems begin to turn into political poems, activist poems, anthems of resistance, is where he's headed.
Right.
Let's hear this. Next ghazal. This video is not that great. Forgive us.
निगल गए सबकी सब समंदर, निगल गए सबकी सब समंदर, जमी बची अब कहीं नहीं है।
वाह वाह, क्या कहना है।
निगल गए सबकी सब समंदर, जमी बची अब कहीं नहीं है। बचाते हम अपनी जान जिसमें, वो कश्ती भी अब कहीं नहीं है।
बहुत अच्छा है, वाह वाह वाह।
वो आग बरसी है दोपहर में कि सारे मंजर झुलस गए हैं।
क्या कहना।
वो आग बरसी है दोपहर में कि सारे मंजर झुलस गए हैं। सुबह सवेरे जो ताजगी थी, वो ताजगी अब कहीं नहीं। वो आग बरसी है दोपहर में कि सारे मंजर झुलस गए हैं। सुबह सवेरे जो ताजगी थी, वो ताजगी अब कहीं नहीं है। तुम अपने कस्बों में जाके देखो, वहां भी अब शहर ही बसे। तुम अपने कस्बों में जाके देखो, वहां भी अब शहर ही बसे हैं। कि ढूंढते हो जो जिंदगी तुम, वो जिंदगी अब कहीं
नहीं। क्या कहना है साहब, वाह वाह वाह। फिर कहना दूंगी, फिर
तुम अपने कस्बों में जाके देखो,
बहुत अच्छा है, वाह वाह वाह।
वहां भी अब शहर ही बसे हैं। कि ढूंढते हो जो जिंदगी तुम, वो जिंदगी अब कहीं नहीं है।
सच्चा शेर।
बहुत दिनों बाद पाई फुर्सत, तो मैंने खुद को पलट के देखा। बहुत दिनों बाद पाई फुर्सत, तो मैंने खुद को पलट के देखा। मगर मैं पहचानता था जिसको, वो आदमी अब कहीं नहीं।
वाह 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 वाह।
बहुत दिनों बाद पाई फुर्सत, तो मैंने खुद को पलट के देखा। मगर मैं पहचानता था जिसको, वो आदमी अब कहीं नहीं है। गुजर गया वक्त दिल पे लिखकर, न जाने कैसी अजीब बातें। गुजर गया वक्त दिल पे लिखकर, न जाने कैसी अजीब बातें। वरक पलटता हूं मैं जो दिल के, तो सादगी अब कहीं नहीं। निगल गए सबकी सब समंदर, जमी बची अब कहीं नहीं।
क्या बात। So the interesting thing about the ghazal, I find, is the coexistence of inevitability, which is the refrain. So everybody knows what the refrain is, and therefore it's like coming back to some. You preempt it and everybody can go wah at the same time. And the combination of inevitability and surprise. And I think the great ghazal is able to do that. It surprises you with how the second line culminates with the rhyme, while you already know how it's culminating with the refrain. So that's the fun of it. And to maintain that in English is a little complicated because of syntax, basically. And here, the refrain is actually, is nowhere to be found. So it's more complicated than just writing something which says right as the refrain. So that was the challenge, and here's my sort of answer. The oceans have all been gulped down. Of ground the slightest trace is nowhere to be found. And that boat that could have kept me afloat, that saving grace, is nowhere to be found. The molten heat of afternoon has scorched everything in sight. The freshness of the morning face is nowhere to be found. Go back to where you came from, you'll find cities have sprung up there. The life you sought, that you thought was your solace, is nowhere to be found. After many days, I got a moment to turn back and look at me, but that person I had once embraced is nowhere to be found. Time wrote strange things upon the heart and then moved on. When I turn the pages there now, a simple grace is nowhere to be found.
वाह वाह, बहुत खूब. I think, when I was listening to him read this, there was that sense of, I don't know quite how to use that word, but when you're listening to a ghazal in Urdu, there's a kind of gentle melancholy, which almost seduces you. There's that sense of falling into the poem. And I was getting that from the English, which I think is quite remarkable. So, well done, Javed. Carry on and do many more for us. One of the things you were talking about, and I think it comes through very well in these recent ghazals that he's read, is the fact that for you it was always very important that they should read as a poem well in English.
Anjum, the problem I've had with translations that I have read is very often I've read a translation and I've said to myself, is this poetry? Is this a poem? And that begins to reflect, because you don't know the original language, on the poor poet himself. And you're wondering, really? Am I supposed to be impressed by this? So I think one of the things that I try to do, and basically because I have nobody to answer to, I shouldn't be on this stage because I'm not published. But, so you can't buy my books. Yes, you can. There's one thing out there. But anyway, basically because I have no one to answer to, no publishers, no deadlines, and I do this rather like doing crossword puzzles. For me, it's fun. But then I set certain impositions on myself, and one of it is, it must sound like it is a poem in English when you read it in English. And the other is of the very important idea of the auditory in Urdu. And therefore, when you read it out aloud, there has to be a music to the way the language moves. There has to be cadence. There has to be not just rhyme. And as we move on, we'll see that there are poems without rhyme, because they are written in blank verse, or they're written in not with rhymes. And rhymes don't lend themselves sometimes to poems like that. But they continue to have a cadence if you can read them right. And I think reading aloud is an art that is not that secure, I find, with English poets as it is with poets of Urdu, because they're used to musha'iras and they're used to wahwas coming. You can wahwa as well from the audience, which spurs them on to greater heights. So I think that idea of reading a poem, reading out a poem, I find is very important to when I translate, because I tend to correct myself by reading the poem aloud several times, rather than by looking at it on the page necessarily. But to come to the idea of logic, what you were saying, and how Javed Sahib has progressed, I think a lot of his later poems are, like the next one I almost find is a lawyer's argument. It's like being in a court of law, but the lawyer is arguing the case for a teardrop. So let's hear him recite that. It's called Asu.
किसी का गम सुन के मेरी पलकों पे एक आंसू जो आ गया है, ये आंसू क्या है? ये आंसू क्या है? गवाह है मेरी दर्दमंदी का, मेरी इंसान दोस्ती का। ये आंसू क्या एक सबूत है मेरी जिंदगी में खुलूस की एक रोशनी का। ये आंसू क्या ये बता रहा है कि मेरे सीने में एक हसास दिल है जो कि किसी की दिलदोज़ दास्तां जो सुनी तो सुन के तड़प उठा है, पराए शोलों में जल रहा है, पिघल रहा है। मगर मैं फिर खुद से पूछता हूं, ये दास्तां तो अभी सुनी है, ये आंसू भी क्या अभी ढला है? ये आंसू क्या मैं समझूं पहले कहीं नहीं था? मुझे तो शक है कि ये कहीं था। ये मेरे दिल और मेरी पलकों के दरमियान एक जो फासला है, जहां ख्यालों के शहर बसते हैं और ख्वाबों की तुरबतें हैं, जहां मोहब्बत के उजड़े बागों में तलखियों के बबूल है और कुछ नहीं है, जहां से आगे हैं उलझनों के घनेरे जंगल, ये आंसू शायद बहुत दिनों से वहीं छुपा था। जिन्होंने इसको जन्म दिया था वो रंज तो मसलहत के हाथों न जाने कब कत्ल हो गए थे, तो करता फिर किस पे नाज आंसू कि हो गया बेजवाज आंसू, यतीम आंसू, यसीर आंसू। न मोतबर था न रास्तों ही से बाखबर था, तो चलते चलते झिझक गया था, ठिठक गया था। इधर से आज एक किसी के गम की कहानी का कारवां जो गुजरा, यतीम आंसू ने जैसे जाना कि इस कहानी की सरपरस्ती मिले तो मुमकिन है राह पाना। तो एक कहानी की उंगली थामे उसी के गम को रुमाल करता, उसी के बारे में झूठे सच्चे सवाल करता, ये मेरी पलकों तक आ गया।
So you already see a kind of arc of, how far he's gone from that simple poem about the tree and the courtyard. And now this is poetry as argument, poetry as emotional argument, but also logic and rational argument. As I said, it's to me a passionate lawyer pleading a case and trying to convince you where the teardrop was and why the teardrop has arrived when it has.
Trying to analyze the teardrop.
Yeah.
Yep.
While listening to another's sorrow, a teardrop has traveled to my eyes. What is this teardrop? Is this teardrop a witness to my compassion, to my humanity? Is this teardrop proof of my life's shining sincerity? Does this teardrop speak of the sensitive heart that beats within me, which but listening to the wrenching tale of another's sorrow begins to throb and burn in a second-hand fire, and so inflamed melts? But then I ask myself, I have heard this story, but now, so is this teardrop freshly minted? Should I believe that this teardrop was nowhere before this? I suspect that it did exist. It lived in that space between my heart and my lashes, where abides a city of feelings, where dreams lie buried in graves, where in the uprooted gardens of love stand trees of bitterness and nothing else, beyond which are the dark jungles of uncertainty. This teardrop lived there, perhaps in secret, a long while. The sorrow that gave birth to it had long been extinguished at the hands of expedience. What then could this teardrop grace? When the teardrop itself had lost its cause and was orphaned, was motherless, was unworthy, was unaccustomed to the roads. So walking by itself, it had stopped, had paused, and was hesitant. But when a caravan carrying the tale of someone else's woe passed this way today, no sooner did the orphan teardrop know that with the aid of this story, it was possible, yes, to find a path again. Then, holding another's tale by the hand, making of that sadness a means, asking of it questions true and false, it has found its way to my lashes now.
Notice how the poet moves the idea of the teardrop from a concept into a humanized form. It sort of gives it a human body, an orphaned creature. Yeah, very nicely done. It's a very different poem from the ones we've been listening to so far, and you've managed to follow the shifting tenors and, sort of the voices that this poet has used in the different translations you've done. So I think that's...
If you say so.
Yeah, so we've already seen Javed Akhtar as a poet of the romantic and the nostalgic, moving into a much more contemporary thinking, analyzing, arguing, sort of a poet of protest. And you had talked about the fact that he's now in his contemporary form very much more political. Comes, of course, from a long political history, which he inherited because his father, as you would know after translating the poems, was himself very a political poet. But so would you like to share a few more of the poems that show him in this other light of the protest and the philosopher?
Yeah, we can go to, because I think we're also running out of time, so we'll skip one poem, we'll skip Waqt, which is a poem of philosophy, because I think there isn't that much time left, and go straight to what I call an anthem of resistance, which is Andhere Ka Samandar. Skip one video and go to Andhere Ka Samandar.
Oh, Hukumnama, which is Hukum.
See at the end.
अंधेरे का समंदर, जहां तक भी नजर जाए अंधेरे का समंदर है.
Raise the volume, please.
उफक तक और उफक के पार भी शायद यही एक मंजर है. अंधेरे का समंदर ही समंदर है. अंधेरे के समंदर में ये एक छोटे से नुक्ते के बराबर रोशनी का एक जजीरा है कि जिस पे हम खड़े हैरान परेशान देखते हैं, और जिधर देखें हर एक सिमत और हर एक जानिब बस एक तारीक पानी है कि जिसमें ऊंची और मगरूर लहरें उठ रही हैं और इधर यूं बढ़ रही हैं जैसे कोई हाथियों की फौज है जो ये जजीरा रौंदने को है. वाह. हर एक लहर आके साहिल पर जब अपना तन पटकती है तो साहिल का कोई कमजोर हिस्सा टूट के साहिल से कटता है. जजीरा पीछे हटता है, सिमटता है. जमीन कम हो रही है, जमीन नम हो रही है, जमीन पैरों तले धंसने लगी है. अंधेरे की समंदर की हवा हम लोगों पे हंसने लगी है. तो क्या खामोश यूं ही डूब जाने का इरादा है?
क्या बात है, वाह वाह जावेद साहब, वाह 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 वाह.
तो क्या खामोश यूं ही डूब जाने का इरादा है? मगर कैसे भुलाओगे कि सूरज के उजालों से तुम्हारा कोई वादा है? तो फिर अब देखते क्या हो? चलो अब कश्तियों की रस्सियां खोलो, समंदर में उतरते. कहीं तो रोशनी की भी जमीनें होंगी, उनको ढूंढने अगर हो सके तो ये अंधेरे का समंदर पार करते हैं, और इस कोशिश में जीते हैं तो जीते हैं, जो मरते हैं तो मरते हैं.
As far as the eyes can see, a sea of darkness that stretches to the horizon, and perhaps even beyond the horizon, this is all there is to see. A sea dark as dark can be. In this sea of darkness, the smallest of dots, this bright island on which we stand, lost, bewildered. Wherever we look, whichever side, whichever direction lies a blackness of water, from there waves rise up, high and arrogant. They advance this way as if they were an army of elephants, intent on trampling this island underfoot. When a wave crashes its body upon the shore, then that bit of land that is weak breaks off and is set adrift. The island steps back and is contained yet a little more. The land is shrinking. The land is turning wet and soft. The land is crumbling under our feet. The winds from the sea of darkness have begun to laugh at us. So what is it that you want? To drown in silence, is that it? And how will you forget the promise you made once to the brilliance of the sun? What are you waiting for? Unmoor the boats. Let us set sail in the sea of darkness. Somewhere beyond there must be islands of light. Let us find them if we can. Let us cross this sea of darkness, and in this attempt, if we live, we live. And if we die, we die.
I think so.
I think given the fact that I have talked too much, we will move immediately to the next and the last poem, which is, I think, of all the poems that you've heard, perhaps the most necessary, because it speaks of a time that we live in, and a time that is perhaps on its way, and a time that I feel not just poets, but everyone must guard against. So we now will hear Naya Hukumnama, which is a brilliant new poem of Javed's.
किसी का हुक्म है सारी हवाएं हमेशा चलने से पहले बताएं कि उनकी समझ क्या है। किसी का हुक्म है सारी हवाएं हमेशा चलने से पहले बताएं कि उनकी समझ क्या है। हवाओं को बताना ये भी होगा, चलेंगी जब तो क्या रफ्तार होगी, कि आंधी की इजाजत अब नहीं। हमारी रेत की सब ये फसीलें, ये कागज के महल जो बन रहे हैं, हिफाजत इनकी करना है जरूरी, और आंधी है पुरानी इनकी दुश्मन, ये सभी जानते हैं। किसी का हुक्म है दरिया की लहरें जरा ये सरकशी कम कर लें, अपनी हद में ठहरे। किसी का हुक्म है दरिया की लहरें जरा ये सरकशी कम कर ले, अपनी हद में ठहरे। उभरना और फिकरना और बिखर कर फिर उभरना, गलत है उनका ये हंगामा करना। ये सब है सिर्फ वहशत की अलामत, बगावत की अलामत। बगावत तो नहीं बर्दाश्त होगी, ये वहशत तो नहीं बर्दाश्त होगी। अगर लहरों को है दरिया में रहना, तो उनको होगा अब चुपचाप बहना।
वाह!
किसी का हुक्म है इस गुलसिता में बस अब एक रंग के ही फूल होंगे। कुछ अफसर होंगे जो ये तय करेंगे गुलिस्ता किस तरह बनना है कल का। यकीनन फूल यकरंगी तो होंगे, मगर ये रंग होगा कितना गहरा कितना हल्का, ये अफसर तय करेंगे। किसी को ये कोई कैसे बताए, गुलिस्ता में कहीं भी फूल यकरंगी नहीं होते, कभी हो ही नहीं सकते, कि हर एक रंग में छुपकर बहुत से रंग रहते।
क्या बात है जावेद साहब।
जिन्होंने बाग यकरंगी बनाना चाहे थे, उनको जरा देखो कि जब एक रंग में 100 रंग जाहिर हो गए हैं, तो वो अब कितने परेशान हैं, वो कितने तंग रहते हैं।
क्या इशारा है, वाह जावेद साहब वाह।
किसी को ये कोई कैसे बताए, हवाएं और लहरें कब किसी का हुक्म सुनती हैं। हवाएं हाकिमों की मुट्ठियों में, हथकड़ी में, कैद खानों में नहीं रुकती। ये लहरें रोकी जाती हैं तो दरिया कितना भी हो पुरसुकून बेताब होता है, और इस बेताबी का अगला कदम सैलाब होता है।
So we'll end with this. It's the new ordinance. Someone has decreed that the very air should, before it begins to move, share which way it plans to go. Let the wind take immediate heed. We need prior notice of direction and speed. We wish it to be so. And to one and all declare this writ, from now on storms we do not permit. These paper palaces, these walls of sand must be kept from harm. We well understand that storms are a grievous threat, and all such threats must be met with a firm hand. Someone has decreed that henceforth the wave, indeed all waves in every river, must learn to behave. How dare they rise and fall and rise again unabated? This is patently wrong and won't be tolerated. These are signs of frenzy, portents of revolt, and they must come to an immediate halt. If these waves still wish to be free, then flow unobtrusively, say we. Someone has decreed the need for monochrome. Flowers must no longer be tainted with an exuberance of color. Their home, the garden, will now be uniformly painted. You can quiet this part. Someone has decreed the need for monochrome. Flowers must no longer be tainted with an exuberance of color. Their home, the garden, will now be uniformly painted. We will appoint official wardens to oversee all future gardens. Flowers of a uniform color will abide, but how deep or light, the officers will decide. Who is to tell the powers that be that flowers are never uniform, you see? It's simply untenable. It can't be done, for even a single color contains more than one. Let us learn from those who had thus decreed and most earnestly had tried to breed flowers that looked the same. How pilloried they are at this game. Who is to tell the powers that be, wind and wave do not bend the knee? You cannot hope to chain the wind, or freedom of the waves rescind. For while you believe that you will win, this seeming calm seethes within. What comes next is a tsunami. Who will tell the powers that be?
Or shall we ask for some questions? Has anybody got questions or comments? Because if you take a second to, all right, I'm getting a sign to continue. But if you do, you can mull it over for a few minutes while we give him a chance to. You had something planned to end with.
No, it's just that, very many people, what a lie, practically no one has asked me about translation. And I thought about it, and Javed Sahab and I did a session together where he recited and I recited the translations, and it went off okay. And after that, a poem struck me, or a thought struck me that became a poem. So I'll end with a poem that I wrote, which is not a translation, but is about translation and the idea of translation. I can hardly see anymore, but I will attempt it Unlike Javed, I don't know everything by heart. Can we switch on that light? Is that possible at all? Have we paid for it? No. All right. Okay, I can see now. Let's go. Do your poems feel stripped of their essence when I dress them in my words? Or instead do they, like migratory birds, take flight, travel day and night to nest elsewhere, and live for a while under a different dispensation, in a different style? Does the slant of the sun there touch them with the same warmth? Does the change in weather make them puff up their feathers and strut about and sing? Do their voices soar above the din? And does the occasional bird lover thrill to find them trilling in their midst? Or do they only please the ornithologist? Who can know? Who can say? Some reach where they want to go, others perish along the way. Those who survive seem to do so happily. But then one day, these birds, unlike words, miss their homeland and fly away. Translations, on the other hand, stay.
So any questions? Sorry. Oh, put it back in, put it in Urdu. No.
Sorry?
Has it been translated into Urdu?
I'm waiting for you to do something for me.
Did I see a hand up somewhere?
These are not
Yes.
poems that are published or known.
There's a hand up at the back there and one here. Yes.
I thought that Hukumnama, both in its original and your translation of it, was amazing.
Thank you.
Where can we get the English version of Hukumnama? Your version, and I think you really translate so beautifully.
Well, it's if you send me your email, I'll share it with you privately. How's that?
Or you can take
Let
my
us start a
printed copy.
relationship here.
You can take my printed copy. I have a copy. You can take that.
Yeah, because, I'm not a published poet. I haven't published any of these.
Yet. He's missing the word yet. He's still collecting them and we're getting there. He's already published his translations of Jan Nisar.
So that is because Javed came to me and said, right.
But yes, but that's it. They're out there and so will these be, we hope. Next question.
Thank you for sharing some of the philosophical poems of Javed Akhtar sir, and we enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Poetry in olden days considered to be the powerful overflow of powerful feelings. No?
Right.
Now in modern times, especially in Tamil Nadu, here in modern times, after this postmodernism and all these things, it has lost its imagery. Not fully, to a maximum extent it has lost its imaginary. Then that form, then that philosophy. It has come out of all these things. Modern poetry.
Okay.
Don't blame me.
Yes. now they say, now we see from the poetry, we could see that there is no place for philosophy in poetry. Philosophy is different and poetry is different. That's what nowadays
is being taught.
Yes.
But did you feel
it's
the
a
same?
School of thought.
Did
but
you
here,
feel this? Yeah.
but here, all philosophy. This we could compare with our Sangam literature or our, our Nidhi Ilakyam. We call it as Nidhi Ilakyam.
Right.
And here we enjoyed it. There is no doubt about it. What do you think about the modern concept of poetry?
That's too large. I will escape it by saying you would have to know much more and read much more and be a kind of modern Ezra Pound to be able to expound on poetry in that manner. I can't, because my knowledge of it is too limited for me to make, a learned exposition of where poetry is, where is it going. Some of it I know is coming my way, and when it does, I'll translate it.
Yeah, one question there, and then we'll end with Sampurna's question.
Really mesmerized by both Javed Akhtar's poems and your translations. They're absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. I want to know, when you hear this poetry and you translate it, the beautiful, absolutely beautiful phrases that came out in your translation, does it come to you spontaneously because you hear that, or do you ponder over that and say, what will sound better?
See, I think what comes first is prosaicness. So you translate for meaning, you translate for what is the poet actually wanting to say. You have to be first grabbed by it, and then you translate, and then, as I say, it's a crossword puzzle. Then I work with rhyme. I work a lot with internal rhyme rather than with end rhymes, if I can, because I think that brings a musicality to the line. I try and work sometimes with run-on lines, which means that, you know, you don't end the thought with the line necessarily. So all of that is long drives and my phone and working at it and having fun. Basically, it's having fun, particularly because nobody's commissioned it, nobody's actually printing it, nobody's reading it. So it's me enjoying myself. But I don't enjoy myself without imposing certain conditions on that enjoyment, which is that I'm honest to the poet, that I feel it must read like poetry, and very importantly to me, it must sound like poetry, because a lot of time when it's written, it reads like prose. So how do you make it sound like poetry? That's through internal musicality of lines and of cadence. Cadence more than anything else, I think.
Beautiful. So I think you've met all your goals. So that's all I can say.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shampoo, you have a question? Yes, we have a question.
Because you'll probably be able to answer it better.
This is a question actually related to both the question that came earlier, which is about modern poetry. And I wanted to ask you, because the absolute ease and effortlessness and cadence and precision of the lines as they came to us in English, and Anjum, you said, now when you move from especially Urdu to English, one expects a kind of formality or artifice or some tonal dissonance. Okay, none of that tonal dissonance was apparent in what you read. And my question has to do with, do you think that is because your knowledge of English also has a classical grounding? I feel it's very strongly classically grounded in the way we were taught English, and yet you've managed to take it and make it and modernize it. So can you tell me a little bit about that grounding? Because I feel it's a very firm ground on which you stand, and therefore it's able to soar where it's gone.
Well, there's certainly grounding, because I grew up, I studied English literature, and I grew up loving poetry. And I think that the relationship with poetry has deepened and has extended over my years. And I don't read it non-analytically. And I think that there is both grounding, and certainly I do analyze why something is working and particularly why something is not working. And I think that is what allows me, if it is at all successful, that's what has made it successful, is the need to find a poetic voice as opposed to a translator's voice necessarily. Because a translator's voice, and translators can take umbrage and be very annoyed with me for perhaps not using exact word translation sometimes. Sometimes because I just don't know the exact, because there could be many variations on a word which I don't know of. But I try and keep it to the idea of what the poet wants to say, and then try and make it my own, and include my own voice in the speaking of it. And I think, yes, certainly a grounding in the language helps, because then at least you're dealing with grammar, syntax of the language itself, which is so completely different from the grammar and syntax of the language you're translating from. So translating, I've always found, is a bit like reading a recipe, because the recipe gives you all the ingredients, but it doesn't give you the dish. And then you have to actually be good on the spot with those ingredients. You must know how to cook to start with, which is grounding. And then you must be inventive with how you're using the recipe, which is your own talent or your own, wherever you're headed with what you're doing. So yeah, certainly grounding, yeah.
Yes, certainly. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah, last question.
Hello.
Last?
Yes.
Yes.
I was very interested in your mentioning of Urdu being very auditory. And
Not auditory, but auditory, meaning you get the fun of the poem a lot of the times when you listen to it.
Yes,
That's because of the idea of the Mushaira and how the Mushaira allowed poets to recite their poetry, and a lot of that is part of how Urdu poetry worked.
yes, I think all our regional languages have gone through that
Yes.
stage of
Absolutely, yeah.
relating to a community of
Yeah.
listeners. So all the wah-wahs and the
Yeah.
sabashas come from there.
Yeah.
So the poet himself is drawing from some sensibility that's already there in the listener in this community. So when we translate into English, I myself am a translator, when we translate into English, we don't have a community to listen to, who will listen actively. So have you found that, your job is a job of a loner who's talking to maybe some hothouse plants like in literary festivals, or maybe by extension non-Urdu speakers? And especially when the rhetoric of politics is so loud today, it's so loud, and regional languages are being submerged in that cacophony of politics. Isn't it a difficult task to be heard? So what are we doing in the end? Are we just passing on this nuanced sensibility from one person to another? Is it a solo effort? And do you find the strain of it? And finally, do you think that Javed Saab is not the author, the poet, and you are the poet?
No, not at all. That I don't believe. I think that would be foolish of me. But there are so many questions embedded in your question that I will try and pick one out of that lot and talk about the loneliness of the translator. Yes, it is lonely, but I think there are rewards in solitude that are not to be found in company necessarily. And so I have no problems with solitude and loneliness. And it's how you use that time, I think. And I get great fun out of doing this stuff, regardless of whether it's going to change the world, it's not. And whether very many people are going to hear it, they're not.
So I think that that's a wonderful way to bring this session to an end. I'd just like to end by saying that translating poetry effectively is one of the most difficult things I know that can be attempted or achieved. And the fact that a poet like Sampurna, who is so sensitive to language, has found that it worked, means that something is right, and that therefore, Sumantra, you should A, persist, get a collection together, and then have it printed, which we can all help you with, and then and then start touring it so that you can recite and read it out loud to everybody like you've been doing.
Anjum runs 2 Lit Fests, so she has everybody's lives planned to the last plane flight.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here.
Thoroughly enjoyed this.